Scripture lesson is taken from the Gospel of Matthew. There's 4 verses. Matthew chapter 5. Remember, this is part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Very familiar verses, and we'll try to take a different direction on what we normally hear from these 2 verses. Jesus says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they will see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." I know it's not news to you all, but love is in the air. Valentine's Day is on Wednesday. And we've been inundated these past few days with hearts and love stories. And we've been told all the things that we need to buy for that special someone in our lives. Their lives are not going to be complete without candy or flowers or a new car or a big screen television. But there's something different about Valentine's Day this year. Does anyone know what it is?
Ash Wednesday.
It's also Ash Wednesday. It's the beginning of Lent. In the Church of Jesus Christ all around the world, Lent is that 6-week time period for Christians to have spiritual preparation to get us ready spiritually to celebrate the resurrection on Easter Sunday morning. Now, do you realize that that has not happened, Ash Wednesday and Valentine's Day on the same day? That has not happened, are you ready? Does anybody know the answer? For 73 years. By the time I was born. So I've never, except as an infant, celebrated, and I don't remember much about that 73 years ago, celebrating Lent and Valentine's Day. Now, there's been a lot on the internet this past week because Ash Wednesday and Valentine's Day on the same day has been creating a lot of problems in relationships. Because a lot of times husbands will want to take their wives out for a romantic candlelight steak dinner, and yet some people will give up meat for Lent. That's a problem. Others will be giving the love of their life Anthony Thomas candy. And some people will go into the Lenten season and say, "Oh, I'm giving up sweets." What do? "You bought me cookies, and I can't have them for 6 more weeks." I would suggest to you that we have a unique opportunity within the Christian church. An opportunity on Valentine's Day to focus on real love, to focus on true love, to focus on the fact that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son that we might have forgiveness for our sin. Jesus is the perfect focus, I believe, for Valentine's Day. God sent the love gift through his Son, through Jesus, and he, we are told in the scripture that we read in our New Testament reading, Jesus is the perfect example of perfect love. God's love gift to the world. It's authentic love. It's not false love. It's love that lasts a lifetime and throughout eternity. His love is a love that changes us and changes those that we love. And his is a love that never, ever, ever disappoints. The scripture tells us that 1 Corinthians, love is the way we're supposed to live. What an appropriate way to celebrate Valentine's Day, and how appropriate it would be for us to, as a church, to say, let's learn what real love is all about. Now, it's been 73 years since Ash Wednesday fell on Valentine's Day. Strangely enough, it's also been 73 years since Easter fell on what? April Fool's Day. What a sense of humor. Can you go back with me to the time when Jesus was brought up on trial and the religious leaders said, this man is dangerous, we've got to get rid of him? And they brought false accusations against Jesus, and the leadership of the church conspired against him. They had a trial, he was convicted, he was nailed on a cross, and he was buried in a tomb, and they sealed the tomb with a huge stone, and the Roman emperor put his stamp upon it just to make sure his disciples couldn't steal his body away. And on that April Fool of all April Fool's Day, they said, there, that should take care of that. Got rid of Jesus. He can't cause any problems. And then on Easter morning, God rose him to life again. And on Easter morning, because of that, everything changed. Our overarching theme throughout the Lenten season is going to be everything changed because of Easter. And we begin that this morning talking about contagious love. Now, we were joking at Bible study this morning. There's a lot of contagious stuff going around. There's flu and there's viruses, and we joked about we're not going to hug today, we're not going to shake hands, we're going to elbow bump or fist bump, because contagious is something we don't want to give it to everybody else. But God tells us that his love is to be contagious spiritually, so that we just infect everyone around us with his perfect love. Now, if you notice the context for the words of Jesus this morning, it's right in the middle of his Sermon on the Mount. And it's fascinating because the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus in the Beatitudes is telling all of us how to be happy, how to be blessed. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. How to be happy. And then right after these 4 verses that we read, Jesus turns right around and he's speaking to the religious leaders of the church in his day. He said, also, I'm going to tell you how to be miserable. Now, that's kind of a depressing topic. But Jesus came into a world and he noticed the emptiness of the religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees and the hypocrites. Theirs was not a real love. Theirs was a false love. And theirs was a false promise. And they looked down on other people. So Jesus, in his Sermon on the Mount, how to be happy, how to be miserable if you keep living the way you are. And then Jesus was saying, I want you to see the contrast between authentic love and imitation or false love. Jesus said, I want you to see, here is a picture of how the church was, but he said, I want you to see how the church should be. And he used the illustration that we've heard over and over again. He gives a simple message on how to be the church. He said, we need to be salt and we need to be light. Now, just a summary, we're to be the salt of the earth and we're to be the light of the world. What does salt do? Salt adds flavor. Salt adds enjoyment. How many of you have ever been or still are on a low salt diet? Any confession time? Now, I'm on a lower salt diet and I'm not good all the time. But at one point in my adult years, I was placed on a bland 4 diet. That means you're not allowed to eat anything that tastes good. It was terrible. no salt whatsoever because I had kind of messed up everything inside. But salt is to make a difference in the food that we eat. Jesus said, salt in our lives, we're to add flavor in our marriage, we're to add flavor on our jobs, we're to add flavor in our friendships. We are to be the salt that makes a relationship much more enjoyable. And he also said we're to be the light of the world. Now, what does light do? Light draws attention. Light helps show the way out of the church. We're getting exit lights installed, and that's going to show the way out. But light does a lot, and light keeps us from falling, and we don't want to trip over things. But I want to suggest to you, for salt to be effective and for light to be effective, two things have to happen. For salt to be effective, salt must interact with our food. It doesn't do any good in the salt shaker. You have to put the salt on the food. And light, to be effective, has to go where there's darkness. Now, Jesus, remember, he's looking at the religious leaders and the way they did church. And they had basically cut themselves off from the people that needed to be reached with the gospel. They cut themselves off. The scribes and the Pharisees, they had a big long list. There's good people and there are bad people. We're obviously the good people. You folks are the bad people. And we're not going to hang around you. And they basically decided these are the people that are not worthy of being in the church. These are people that we don't want to associate with. And so they had a long list. You don't hang around sick people because you're going to be contaminated. You sure don't want to hang around poor people. They had a long list of the undesirable people in their society, and they just looked down on them. You don't hang around lepers, and you sure don't want to hang around Samaritans. They had separated themselves out and said, we're staying away from those people. What did Jesus say? Those are the very people I came to love. You remember some of the self-righteous poetry of past generations? We don't smoke and we don't chew and we don't hang with those who do. That was the religious leaders. But remember, salt can't be salt and light can't be light unless it interacts with food and darkness. Now, interestingly enough, this passage is found in Matthew's gospel. Do you realize when Matthew wrote these words of Jesus, Matthew knew what he was talking about. Matthew was part of the bad guys. What was his profession? He was a tax collector. He collaborated with the Roman government. He was greedy. He extorted money out of the Jewish people. People looked at tax collectors as turncoats and traitors. And the common people looked upon them. They were despised. They would cheat everyone out of their money. They were one of the bad guys. So here you have a tax collector, Matthew, and one day he's sitting at the IRS office and he's extorting money, and Jesus came along. Now, the scribes and Pharisees would avoid tax collectors, not Jesus. Jesus walked right up to Matthew and said, Matthew, I need you. Me? You can't be talking about me, Jesus. I'm a tax collector. Jesus said, Matthew, I can use you to help me change the world. Jesus, are you sure? I'm hated. I'm despised. Yeah, I'm greedy. I've kind of worked with the Romans and I've stolen money from the Jewish people. You can't actually mean you want me. Jesus said, I want you, Matthew. and I want you to be one of my disciples. So Matthew went from being outcast to being chosen by Jesus, and now he's a disciple. Do you want to know what the first thing Matthew did after he became a disciple? He threw a party. Now, if you've ever been excluded and ostracized and laughed at and put down, when somebody includes you, you get excited. Matthew was so excited. Somebody loves me. Somebody sees worth in me. Who do you suppose Matthew invited to his party? Well, the only people he knew. A bunch of other tax collectors. And they were hated. And he had some other friends too. And they were classified as sinners. Part of the lowlife that the church didn't want to have anything to do with. And he invited tax collectors, sinners, lowlives, and he invited Jesus and his disciples. Now, I think Jesus was excited to be invited to Matthew's party with all these outcasts of society. I kind of get the feeling, I know his disciples from reading Scripture, I don't think the disciples were excited about being there, hanging around tax collectors and sinners. But they went because Jesus said, this is why I came. I want to love these people. The religious leaders were standing back and they saw the crowd that was being invited to this party. And they said, if he knew the quality of folks that are in that place, he wouldn't want to have anything to do with them. And the scripture says, Jesus, being the Son of God, he knew their thoughts. They were just standing back, murmur, 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 murmur. And Jesus knew their thoughts. And he said, hey guys, these folks, this is why I came. Why? So he could be light and so he could be salt. That's Jesus' method of evangelism. He calls people like Matthew. He changes people like Matthew and like you and I. And then he sends them back out into the world to be salt and to be light. To touch the lives of their friends and their family and their associates. And then they will see them as changed people because of Jesus. Almost as though Jesus was saying, contagious love. This is how you do it. I want you to catch it. Now, wasn't anything new for God. God had used that method of evangelism ever since the beginning of time. Started with Adam and Eve. Things kind of went haywire because of sin. He said, I'm going to start over. And he started over with Noah. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And so God said, I want to take Noah. We're going to start over. And we're going to do it right this time. Things didn't work out. A little bit later, he had to work on a fellow by the name of Jonah. And then sent Jonah back into the darkest place in their world at that time, Nineveh. Why? So they could be salt and light. And then eventually he called a fellow by the name of Abraham and said, I'm going to start with one man, and I will create out of this obedient servant of mine, Abraham, descendants that will multiply and be like the sands of the sea. By the way, we've arranged for Abraham to join us for worship on Maundy, Thursday. I talked to Pastor Ken and I said, you've got more contacts than I do. Can you get a hold of Abraham and ask if he would come share with us? So Abraham is going to be here. But what did God do with Abraham? He called him out, he changed him, and then he said, I want to reach the world through you. It's all about contagious love. 4 biblical examples. 2 of them in the Old Testament, 2 of them in the New Testament, because God's method of evangelism has not changed. The first one is in 2 Kings chapter 5. It's the story about a Syrian general by the name of Naaman. And Naaman had conquered Israel, took his army in, wiped them out, took back to Syria, as they did in those days, a whole bunch of slaves because they wanted to use the best and the brightest from the conquered nations to serve and wait tables. So they brought them back as slaves, and life was good. Naaman was a war hero. He was on the top of the hill. Everything, everybody loved Naaman. And then something happened. Naaman contracted leprosy. Now, in our society, we don't understand that. But in their society, when you contracted leprosy, that was the end of your social life. Your families would say goodbye to you. You lost your job, you lost any income, and you couldn't even go back into a city. You were banished outside of town by the garbage dump, and all you could live on were the scraps that people would throw over the hillside, and you could get enough just to stay alive. That was where you would live, and that was where you would die. So now you've got this amazing, successful army general by the name of Naaman, and God wanted to reach him with the message of love. As word got out about Naaman's got leprosy, someone whispered in his ear, there's this girl, one of the slaves that you brought back from Israel. There's this girl, and I think she has someone who can help you. Well, it's like if you get a dread disease today and somebody says, I know a really good doctor, what are we going to do? We want to get a hold of that doctor. So there is a girl. Now, stop and think. This slave girl, her country had been defeated. She had been ripped away from family and friends, most of them probably killed. She's transplanted over into Syria, and now she's a slave and will probably live and die there as a slave. And yet she was not filled with bitterness and anger and revenge, but she had given all of that to God. And so when they sent some over to there is a girl, she said, yeah, I know somebody who can help. Now, if any of us had been there, we might have been tempted to say, serves you right. You got leprosy, you killed everybody back in my homeland. But she said, I want to get you in touch. And she said, there is a man that can help you. And his name was Elisha. So they go over to Elisha, and old Naaman comes in with all these chariots and horses and everything. And he said, I heard tell you could help me with my leprosy. And Elisha said, oh no, it's not me. I don't have any power. He said, I'd like to connect you. There is a God, the God of Israel. There is a girl. There is a man. There is a God. And he got in touch with this man of God. And the first thing the man of God told him to do was go jump in the lake. He said, get rid of your pride and your arrogance and go down and dip yourself 7 times in the river. And God healed him. And listen to what Naaman said now. Remember, salt can't be salt unless it touches the food. Light can't be light unless it touches the darkness. God reached into the darkness of captivity, and when he was healed, listen to what he said. There is no God in the world like the God of the girl and the prophet, the one true God of Israel. What do you suppose Naaman did when he went back home? He told him, I met a man through a girl who got me in touch with a God who has cleansed me and changed my life. That's how God reaches people in darkness. Old Testament story number 2. This is still in 2 Kings, and this is in chapter 7. Now, the Syrian king was putting under siege the city of Samaria. And it tells us what they did is they get their armies. If our church building is the city of Samaria, it's a whole lot bigger than Columbus. But if it's the city of Samaria, the king would take his army and they would surround. So the whole church is surrounded. The whole city of Samaria is surrounded. And they don't have to fight. They just camp out there. Week after week, after month, they can't go out of the city to get food. They can't go out of the city to get water. The armies just hold them under siege until they waste away and die of starvation in their week, and then they go in and clean up and kill everyone. How bad was it? It was at the end of this siege, and things were so bad in Samaria that they had reduced themselves to cannibalism. The king of Israel was heartbroken because one day there were two women that came, and the one woman said, we realized that we both had a child, and we agreed to each other, we're going to have to kill one child and eat him. You kill your child first and we'll eat him, and then we'll kill my child. We'll live a little bit longer. And the woman said, so we killed my child and ate him. And when it came time for her to sacrifice her son, she wouldn't do it. And they went to the king, and it said the king was heartbroken. And he went to God in prayer, and he said, God, these are my people. Look what they've been reduced to. They're killing and eating each other. You've got to bring salvation. At the same time, we hear the story in chapter 7 of 4 lepers. Remember what I said, what happened to lepers? They get kicked out. Here were 4 lepers. They were living inside the city, and the city fathers decided, we don't want to waste food on lepers. So they kicked them outside of the city walls. They closed the gate, and so now you've got cannibalism and hopelessness on the inside and 4 lepers on the outside of the city wall. And they're sitting there talking, and they said, what are we going to do? If we sit here, we're going to die because there's no scraps coming over the wall. If we sit here, we're going to die. Let's see. Well, we could try to climb back in and go inside, but they already told us if we come back inside the city, they're going to kill us. So if we stay here, we're dead. If we go back inside, we're dead. And one of them said, what about if we march out there into the middle of the Syrian army and throw ourselves on the mercy of the Syrians? Maybe, yeah, they'll probably kill us, but there's a chance that they may have mercy upon us and give us scraps that we can live some. So they marched out saying, can't go in the city, can't stay here. Hopelessness and despair drove them. They marched into the Syrian encampment, and God, in his infinite love and mercy, had caused the army to be overcome with fear right at dinner time, and they all took off. They marched in thinking they were going to be killed on sight because they were lepers, and they got in. There were no army there. There was no army. There were no soldiers. All there was banquet table after banquet table. Everything, I mean, roast turkey, White Castles, everything that they wanted to keep them going. And they dove in and they just started gorging themselves. And finally, one of the lepers said, we can't do this. We've got our brothers and sisters back in the town, and they're eating each other. If we stay here filling our faces while they die, God's going to bring judgment. Now remember, like the slave girl, they had to get over anger and resentment and bitterness and revenge. They could have said, too bad, they kicked us out to let us die. We'll let them stay there and they can die. They said, no. God commands us to go where there's hunger. And so they went back. And the people inside the city thought it was a trap. They finally went out and realized it is a God thing, and they saved them. God provided salvation, but they had to get light to where there was darkness. They had to overcome all of their feelings in between. John chapter 4. Jesus met a woman at the well some years later in, strangely enough, the same city where they had the siege, at the well outside of Samaria. Now remember, the Samaritans were looked at as half-breeds, and they were the bad people, and you couldn't have any relationship with them. As a matter of fact, if a good Jew were traveling and he wanted to get from point A to point B, and in the middle was Samaria, the Jew would never think about going through Samaria. They would go up to the outskirts of the city. They'd take a hard right till they got around to the outskirts of the city, and then they go north, and then they go west, and they travel days out of their way just so they didn't have to set foot in the city where the bad people live. Samaritans, what did Jesus say? You got to have contagious love. Jesus went right into the town square at the well in Samaria. And you remember he met a lady that had gone out to draw water for her family, and he said, if you would ask me, I would give you living water, and you wouldn't have to come out here to this well anymore. Now, Jesus was speaking spiritually. She said, oh, if I didn't have to come out to this well, tell me more about this living water. And Jesus said, go back and get your husband. Now, light into darkness. Now, the humor of this story is, the woman said, I don't have a husband. Got nobody to go tell. Can you imagine if you're that woman and this stranger that shouldn't even be talking to you because he's a Jew and you're a Samaritan said, go tell your husband, and she kind of fudged the truth and said, I don't have a husband. Jesus said, you got that right, lady. You don't have a husband. Matter of fact, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you're living with right now, he's not your husband. Now, if you're her, what are you going to say? Whoa, this dude knows everything about me, and he still loves me. It's said after Jesus revealed that, she went running back into town where the darkness was. She ran back into town, and she said, you've got to come hear this preacher. This guy told me everything I've ever done, and it says the whole town came rushing out to meet Jesus. Now, what did he just do? Salt, light, going where the darkness was, and it says the whole town came out to see Jesus. Do you get the idea that Jesus wants us to be salt and light? That's how we're going to reach our family and our neighbors. Last example, Acts chapter 9. There's a story of about a seamstress whose name was Dorcas. Now, the only thing we know about Dorcas is, it says her life was filled with good works and charitable deeds. That's not a bad way to have people remember you. Dorcas became sick and died, and they had a visitation for her. Now remember, her life was filled with good works and charitable deeds, and so the whole town came out to grieve the death of Dorcas. They got word that Dorcas had died, and one of Jesus' disciples came and brought her back to life. There was a lot of excitement. Everyone couldn't believe. She was dead, and now she's alive again. Do you know what they brought with them to the visitation service? Now, a lot of times when you go to a visitation for someone that's died, you bring food to help the family. Do you know what everyone that came to the visitation brought? I got to show you what Dorcas made me. Well, you know, when I was sick, she brought this and she made a blanket for me. Everyone came and they said, this is how Dorcas showed her love to me. And after she was brought back to life again, it said, many in the town of Joppa became followers of Jesus. Why? Salt and light. That's the way Jesus wants us to live. I find humor in the last verse of that account there. It says, and Peter, who God had used to bring light into darkness, and Peter, because so many people were hungry to hear the gospel, it says Peter stayed many days in Joppa telling everyone about Jesus. And I love the humor in Scripture. Do you know whose house he stayed at? He stayed at the house of Simon. What was Simon's job? He was a tanner. He handled dead animal skins, which the church said, oh, you can't hang around dead animals. Those are the bad people. And Peter said, you know, I know my religion tells me to stay away from dead animals and dead people, but I've been around one dead person and she's alive again. I think I'm going to stay at the house of Simon the tanner so I can do what Jesus wants us to do, to be salt and light. Do you know anyone in your family, on your job, in your community, any friends that need to make a connection that you can be the salt of the earth and give their life flavor, and that they may be living in darkness, and you have the privilege of letting your light shine that they may see the life of Christ? That's a Valentine's story of monumental proportions. Let's celebrate as we go into the Lenten season, realizing that's all Jesus wants us to do. Not to build walls to keep people away from us, but to touch the lives of other people. That's my prayer for each of us. Be salt and be light.